Hello and welcome to Civil Society Speaks, the podcast by social platform dedicated to amplifying the voices of civil society organizations from all over Europe. My name is Andrea Abril, and for this episode, we have the pleasure of featuring Women Against Violence Europe, a network of over 170 European women's NGOs working towards the prevention and protection of women and children from violence. And we are excited to meet two key members of their team today. Joining us are Eliana Jimeno, its Severe Advocacy Advisor, and Elena Floriani, WAVE's Project and Research Coordinator. Welcome both.
Thank you so much, Adriana.
Let's start with a big picture. What are the primary challenges women face regarding violence in Europe today?
Hi, and first of all, thank you for having us. So I can start by mentioning that, yes, we saw actually there have been some big advancements in recent years towards preventing violence against women and domestic violence. So we witnessed some important improvements in legislation, in policy frameworks, also awareness-raising campaigns and much more. And for sure, these efforts have brought some positive change and they increased the protection for many women in Europe. But still, we're also witnessing some concerning trends. For instance, the growing resistance to recognize violence against women as a gendered issue, both at the policy level, but also in public discourse. And also an increasing use and spread of gender-neutral policies. So the term women is therefore very often, it disappears and it's less welcomed in policy documents, for instance. This avoidance of using the term women is a challenge because it does not recognize that violence against women is a societal problem that is rooted in patriarchal society that perpetuates differences among women and men. So we think it's important to underline that we are facing these kind of struggles right now that makes it even more difficult for women in Europe to actually access to policies and legislation that are targeted to them and that take into account the gendered nature of violence against women and gender-based violence. Because we all know that this violence occurs because of the patriarchal structures that are embedded in our society, because of the gender-based power imbalances that we see in our everyday life. So these systemic issues that are part of our societies are those that are holding women back in all their endeavors, from their personal life to their social life, professional life. And also these are the structures that put women at risk of experiencing gender-based violence. Gender-based violence has many different faces, and women experience many different forms of gender-based violence. There are those forms that are, let's say, more recognized, like physical violence, like sexualized violence, but there are also a lot of forms of violence that are less acknowledged. And even if they are less visible, they are equally damaging for women. For instance, economical violence, institutional violence, psychological violence, online violence, and the list goes on. So all these forms of violence, we should also keep in mind that very often are interrelated and that women often experience multiple forms of violence at the same time. What is also very challenging is that survivors of these forms of violence face additional obstacles when they try to reach for support and to access justice. We know that in Europe, there is a very big lack of specialist support services all over Europe. Most European countries fall short of the recommendations of the Istanbul Convention, as it is mentioned in our latest WAVE country report. To give you an example, the Istanbul Convention recommends that there is a minimum of one shelter space per 10,000 heads of population. And as mentioned in the latest country report, we know that in 2022, only 20% of the European countries analyzed in the report, which is 10 out of 46 countries, are actually meeting these standards. This equals to 54% of the recommended bed spaces still missing. So more than half of the recommended bed spaces for survivors of violence in Europe are still missing. And the situation doesn't get better. Actually, it's even worse when it comes to other services, such as women's centers or sexualized violence support services. So basically, due to the lack of space, of resources within women's specialist services, and also due to the lack of an adequate geographical distribution of such services, the protection of survivors from violence cannot be guaranteed in Europe right now. What we should also keep in mind when we're talking about the challenges related to violence against women is that there is a lack of recognition of the intersectional aspects and phase of violence against women. A very clear example concerns, for instance, migrant and undocumented women. In Europe, there is a very worrying shift in discourse that is moving away from the respect of the human and fundamental rights of migrant and undocumented and refugee women towards criminalizing solidarity and emphasizing the supposed threats. So this rhetoric, which is normally driven by right-wing and far-right-wing politicians and is based on fear, it undermines the rights and the basic human rights of the most vulnerable women among us. So it is crucial to highlight that this kind of approach does not serve the rights of women in Europe and does not recognize also the intersectional dimensions of violence against women.
Thank you very much, Elena. And how does WAVE help to address all of these challenges?
So WAVE, as you know, is a network that is already 30 years old. So in the last 30 years, the network has been working to promote and strengthen the human rights of women and their children and to prevent violence from happening. So we are basically standing on 30 years of experience and expertise of women's organizations and women's rights activists from 46 countries in Europe. Our work as a network and as a representative of all of these organizations is based on three main pillars. Firstly, we work on advocacy and campaigning. So our aim is to amplify the voice of our members and to strengthen legislation to combat violence against women and girls. To give you a concrete example, we are currently collaborating with other organizations such as PICUM and other partners and members to challenge the negative discourses about migrant women, as I was mentioning before, and to remind decision makers that the EU member states have a responsibility towards this population under the Istanbul Convention, under CEDAW and other treaties. The second pillar that is a big part of our work as WAVE Network is capacity building. Being a network of members, we try to provide them with many different opportunities like trainings, like working groups, partnership projects, like resource mobilization, for instance, through re-granting. So this is a very important part of the work as a network. And the third pillar on which our work stands is research. We aim with research at building an evidence base of the status and the value of women's specialist services in Europe. And an example is the report I was mentioning before, the WAVE country report that provides an overview and statistics related to the situation of women's specialist services in 46 countries, and which also is a tool to assess the compliance of European countries with the standards of the Istanbul Convention and not only. So these are the three main pillars, but I would also like to mention that one area on which we are focusing a lot is primary prevention. Because primary prevention aims at stopping violence from happening in the first place, which is very key. Primary prevention works through challenging gender stereotypes, fostering a culture of consent with school-based programs, for example, or providing tools such as feminist self-defense trainings, and is fundamental to the success of any strategy to prevent and eradicate violence against women and girls. At the same time, I think it's important to mention that the increased attention to and hopefully increased resources for primary prevention should never be at the cost of reducing the provision of secondary and tertiary prevention, because also survivors of violence have the right to be supported to exit the loop of violence and to live a life free from violence. So policymakers need to use the combined effects of these three levels of a public health approach to violence prevention. And as I mentioned, the conferences and meetings that we also organized as a network connected to the topic of prevention, maybe it's worth mentioning here, as it could be interesting for the listeners that our annual conference this year has primary prevention as the main focus. And the title of the conference is From Emergency Support to Violence Prevention, 30 Years of Championing Women's Rights. So if anyone is interested, it's taking place in Vienna on September 30th and October 1st.
Amazing. And now we have seen that the European Parliament recently adopted a rule that to combat violence against women. Do you think this marks an important step forward, or is there still a lot more that needs to be done?
Thank you for that question, Andrea. So the EU recently adopted the European Directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence. It was adopted in May this year. It entered into force in June, but member states have 3 years for the process of integrating that directive into their national legislation, which is called the process of transposition. For us at WAVE, our perception is that the directive is a little bit of a mixed bag. So on the one hand, as Elena was mentioning at the beginning, it is very important to recognize that, of course, in comparative terms, when we look at how the situation was maybe 30 years ago, when WAVE started, of course, we have advanced quite a bit, but the step that we were expecting to have finally the first of its kind directive specifically focusing on violence against women and domestic violence, we feel that it fell short of our expectations, but also of the needs and the challenges that Elena was just mentioning. So for us, of course, directives are minimum standards for all member states. It means that some member states can go and further and implement other actions that go beyond what it is in the directive. But nonetheless, it really sets a minimum standards approach in terms of prevention of violence against women, access to justice, access to services, and also the possibility of increasing the process of collecting data concerning this specific type of crime. So for us, we would have expected that the Council would have shown more commitment in this directive, and that some elements that are key, because we're talking about combating gender-based violence in 2024. And for example, there are key elements that are not present there, like the criminalization of rape, which was a huge discussion in the months towards the final approval of the directive. It also is not protecting migrant and undocumented women, and as it should. So it is setting an obstacle in terms of the access to specialized support. When they go to this specialized support, member states can decide to send their information to migration authorities that effectively is curtailing their rights to access to these women specialist services that WAVE represents. And it also does not consider key dynamics that in the feminist community, and also women that face gender-based violence against them have experienced in the past, which is the interconnection between intimate partner violence and cases of child custody. So assigning child custody rights when there is a perpetrator involved. And all of those elements are the ones that we have hoped that the directive could take into account. Of course, there are key elements included which we see as positive, in, for example, the inclusion of specific crimes when it comes to online violence, that there's more clarity in terms of the full process and the access to justice that survivors should go through, that there is the need for a multi-layered and multi-agency approach, but nonetheless, it is something that could have been for sure better. It could have been like at the standard of the needs. It could have met the needs that we currently have. And what we feel is that currently the directive does not fully align with the parameters of the Istanbul Convention, of the CEDAW conventions. And it is kind of this sour feeling for us that being the first directive that is addressing this specific issue, this is not included in the directive. It also does not include other situations like forced sterilization. It does not recognize femicide. And this has to do, of course, there's this whole discussion with the legal basis of the directive and how, because in the EU, gender-based violence against women is not considered, it's not an Euro crime, that it is included in the treaties, then member states consider that it was not possible to go further. But nonetheless, this is something that was also part of the discussion and was part of the different possibilities that they could have decided first to agreed on this being an Euro crime and then issue the directive. So for us, it will be key after the 3 years of transposition to follow up at the national level to see to what extent have member states transposed the directive, if there had been any changes specifically in those countries that have a much more advanced legislation, like for example Spain, to see also in 5 years after the implementation, so after they have had the chance to start implementation and see results around 2030, to see, okay, has this made a change? Because the thing is that with directives, member states need to ensure that the spirit of the directive is what is achieved, but they can decide how to go about the implementation very differently. And as Elena was mentioning beforehand, of course, that implies the commitment of different governments, and with the change in the narrative in Europe, and also the presence of different actors that are not necessarily recognizing women's rights, then it is a question mark for us. How is this going to this process going to happen? How is the implementation going to look like? And is it really going to serve women in the end? Or is it going to continue to fall like below the standards of what is actually needed to be able to not only combat violence, but prevent violence against women from happening in the first place?
Thank you very much. Now, for citizens that may not be familiar with WAVE's work, how can they support you, your mission, and how can, well, support you to combat violence against women?
So we believe that this is like a twofold approach. On the one hand, of course, the possibility of supporting WAVE. But before that, we think that it is very important that citizens also see themselves as active actors who can stop this type of violence from happening in the first place, as I was mentioning beforehand. So for us, taking collective action, having a commitment to civil courage, taking the responsibility when you're a bystander and you're seeing that something is happening, you hear that something is happening, I don't know, in the apartment above where you live, that you don't just leave it like, okay, this is a family situation and I will not get involved, but rather to speak up against violence against women, to be able to support the victims, to be conscious of the potential stereotypes that you might carry yourself and continue to reinforce in the way you're talking about women, in the way you consider, oh yeah, no, it's because that is how this specific culture behaves. I mean, there are so many different stereotypes that are also linked to violence against women that I think is very important that we can like look internally, that we can check our own biases, and that we can also use our privileges to just put those privileges to be able to support people who have the agency, have voice, but nonetheless are not heard. So that there are so many things that we can do. And in terms of civil courage for us, of course, we know that it's not an easy step, but there are, as we have mentioned, different trainings. In this case, this will be a type of primary prevention training, so one can learn how to act, how to react in a case where you can see that there is violence against women happening in front of you, I don't know, in the metro or in the streets, and also to be conscious of the type of ideas that you're also like perpetuating when it comes to sexist jokes or ideas about, oh, a woman shouldn't be in power, or oh, it's okay if they are not present in the room. There's so many things and different phases, as Elena was mentioning, of how violence against women can look like, and we tend to think that, okay, only at the very end or only when things are getting very tricky, that is when violence is happening. But there are other very subtle forms of violence that we might not be aware of. And that's why also I would encourage listeners to think about, okay, maybe there is a place in my hometown where these conversations are taking place, to engage with communities, to engage with women specialist services, to be part of the conversation, and to learn and to build community in a way that is also making us more resilient and allows us to take an active role, and not just to feel, okay, this is happening and I don't have anything to do here, because we actually have so much that we can do to prevent this violence from happening in the first place.
Yeah, thank you, Eliana, for mentioning this. I think this is the very first step that each of us has to make. And as you were asking how people that are not familiar with our work can concretely support WAVE, maybe just to add to what Eliana was saying, we've been saying that WAVE is a very big network. Right now, we are almost at 180 women's NGOs all over Europe. And to give a better picture of what this means, like our members are, for instance, NGOs that are running women's helplines or that are running shelters that offer safe accommodation and support, or women's centers. We also have members that focus on research on gender-based violence and gender equality. So it's a big variety of women's NGOs. And very often they are doing this amazing job, incredible work with very limited resources. As it's often, unfortunately, the case for NGOs and specifically for women's NGOs. So I would invite the individuals that are interested in supporting to have a look at our website. There is a full list of all our members, and maybe they can check which organization is active in my city or in my region and reach out to them directly and see if they need any support. It could be time, it could be, if possible, a donation. There are different ways of supporting women's organizations, from the small action like sharing their campaigns on social media to putting some donations, or to actively going there and donating time and resources. Otherwise, it's also possible to donate directly to WAVE, and the donations we receive, they go into our Solidarity Fund. And the Solidarity Fund is what we use to support those women specialist services that are part of our network and are facing very difficult times, for instance, because of humanitarian struggles or political instability or economic, environmental challenges, any kind of struggles where they need additional support. That's where we try to help with what we have in our Solidarity Fund. So that's also a very concrete option to provide for help And there are more informations on our website on how to donate.
Thank you. What will be your main ask to European decision makers for this new mandate?
Well, aligned with our strategic priorities, it will be key that decision makers first are not afraid of including women and women issues in their policies and action plans. Up until now, there has been a lot of development in that regard, but it tends to be put on a silo. So it's kind of, okay, it's kind of the talk in town in the parliament, but also the feeling that we had when we engaged with some of these decision makers that the directive is done and then we are done. So we don't need to do much more in terms of gender-based violence against women. And we think that is not the case because, as Elena was mentioning beforehand, there is this push against recognizing that gender-based violence is a gendered issue. And because of that, it needs to have a very specific approach and earmark, for example, resources, so that those resources that are allocated, for example, within the new multi-annual financial framework are specifically directed to feminist organizations and even more to women specialist services, so that feminist grassroots organizations can provide the support that the states are also expecting that we provide. Because the kind of the paradox that we have is that states are not necessarily picking up the bill. They are not necessarily providing those services, as Elena was mentioning, in terms of our own findings of the country report. But they are not putting the resources where it's needed. So for us, that will be a key ask. In general, we know that there could be the potential defunding of the whole social pillar and all services linked to it. So for us, it will be key that member states and also the different decision makers in the Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council, that they are aware that we need to continue to keep a strong funding for these specific actions, because otherwise all of what we have achieved up until now is just going to fall down. We need to make sure that the resources and also, our taxpayers' money goes to cover our needs as citizens. So that will be key. For us, it will be also very important that there is a new gender equality strategy. The one that we currently have will run out next year. So the next one is supposed to be 2025, 2030. For us, it is very important that this gender equality strategy, as well as the roadmap for women's rights that President von der Leyen announced in her political guidelines, include women specialist services and cover the gaps that the directive left. So that means promoting a culture of consent, including intersectional forms of discrimination with regards to violence against women, a strong support for migrant and undocumented women so that they can have access to these specific services. And then there is also the consideration of the interconnection between intimate partner violence and child custody proceedings. And for us, it's also very important that the EU continues to uphold its responsibilities when it comes to international conventions. There has been a lot of requests, of course, that the Istanbul Convention, now that the EU acceded, although in a limited capacity, that this is implemented. But we also need to remember that there are other conventions like the CEDAW Convention that are complementary to the Istanbul Convention that also need to be implemented. So not just to focus on just one thing and then we're done. Because similar to what I said with the directive, with the Istanbul Convention, there is the same feeling. Okay, we acceded partially, but now we are good. No, there are other responsibilities that also applies for the situation of migrant women. So that will be key. And for us, we will continue to advocate and to ensure that decision makers and different European institutions actually commit to preventing violence against women and girls. For us, of course, because of the structure of EU legislation, there is so much focus on the crimes. So everything is looked through that very specific lens. But for us, what is valuable is we don't want to be, to just take care of what happens after the crime. We need, as a society, to take care of preventing that this happens in the first place. And the European Commission launched last year a platform for the prevention of gender-based violence. There we have seen very interesting conversations, but we hope to see also primary prevention being discussed there. So not only secondary and tertiary prevention, which are very important, but also to consider primary prevention. So that for us will be key. And then there is discussion in terms of, again, what I had mentioned beforehand, the culture of consent, the prevention of rape, promoting the autonomy of women and girls, ensuring that there is access to sexual health and reproductive rights. So all of those aspects that continue to be discussed and now put into question under the current political climate, that needs to be addressed and be considered by decision makers. And in general, just to continue to be allies of this specific portfolio. We know that there is a lot going on and there are many demands, and at the same time, we cannot just disregard what is happening in terms of social policy. And for us, that this continues to be a pillar of what Europe means, it is very important. I would like to add a point specifically concerning the importance of partnerships and collaboration among civil society organizations. The structure of again, legislation and action plans and how things work also, even in terms of funding, sometimes lead us to believe that we are working alone and on our own silos. And I will encourage decision makers to consider that civil society organizations, we are seeking to be able to defend fundamental rights and human rights all over Europe. And in that regard, we try our best to collaborate and to build partnerships. However, when there is such a decrease in funding, basically you're putting us against each other. And I find that very negative. So, and it is also just detrimental in general to having a healthy civil society. There are also many changes in terms of the shrinking of the civic space, sometimes the criminalization of solidarity, the criminalization of the work of civil society. So more generally, I think what will be very important to consider is that putting the blame on civil society or considering us as a threat is not really reinforcing democracies. We are here as active advocates who are also watching that specifically fundamental rights and human rights are upheld. So we have a key role in our societies and in our democracies. And sometimes that role can mean that we are going to make decision makers uncomfortable, but we are also here to have those discussions and to openly talk about what are the different ways in which certain challenges can be addressed. So we are allies. We're critical allies, not only in the sense of being critical to the situations and how things are being addressed, but also critical for the health of our democracies. So I think for us, and WAVE has played that role. We build partnerships and we constantly try to bring different organizations together and bring different perspectives as with our different members. And for us, it is key that that specific space for civil society continues to be respected and it is supported in the next 5 years that we have with the new EU institutions.
This has been Civil Society Speaks, the podcast dedicated to amplifying the voices of civil society organizations from all over Europe. Thank you, Eliana. Thank you, Elena, for sharing our insights with us today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having us.